Okay, so I am here with my good friend, Dr. Will Cole. Will, what's going on, man?
Not much. How are you?
I'm good. Well, not much. I know you're just saying that because you've had your plate absolutely full. You got a brand new book that's been being ready to be released here at the end of August of this
Yeah.
year. So I know you've been a busy man over the past year.
Yeah, not much as in this present moment. I'm working on my present moment awareness. So in this present moment, I'm talking to you.
I love it. Very, very cool. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd love to talk to you about this new book that you have, and I want to get into some other important topics like inflammation and maybe adrenal support and detoxification and functional medicine in general, because that's a really important topic. But let's talk about your new book. It's called, I think it's going to be called Ketotarian, and I'm sure there's a subtitle to it and so forth. But can you tell me a little bit about what you've been up to with that?
Yeah. So as you know, I've been in functional medicine for about a decade now. I kind of live and breathe this stuff, and just kind of seeing the practical application of all the cool health benefits of the ketogenic diet, but at the same time seeing the pitfalls of how maybe conventional or mainstream today, because it is so popular, how a lot of people are doing the ketogenic diet. And then myself, I was a vegan in another lifetime in my 20s for about 10 years. And most of my 20s and my teens, I was a vegan. So I have a heart for that community and, you know, the well-intentioned nature of it and all that stuff. And then now I'm in the ketogenic world and the functional medicine world and the real foods world. And I thought, you know what? If we can't agree on, like, let's find what we have in common. And what I wanted to do is sort of bring both worlds together where they're seemingly opposite, and kind of this amalgamation of the best of the plant-based world and the best of the ketogenic world. And that's what Ketotarian is. It's really this fusion plant-based ketogenic lifestyle system that I put together in the book that's coming out this August.
Man, I love that because, you know, there's so much sort of preference bias amongst these different groups, you know. So I'll go to a conference that's low carb or keto focused, and, you know, all the studies are all about how wonderful the ketogenic diet is. And then I'll you know, talk to some of my friends and colleagues who are vegan, vegetarian based, and all the studies are all about that. And there's no good studies on, you know, how a ketogenic or low carb diet could possibly be healthy. And, you know, you just have to scratch your head and say the truth is somewhere in the middle here. So, you know, of course, the trick is finding what is that middle ground, if there is a middle ground, and you know, how to apply that to people to be healthy. But before we get into that, because I want to ask you that question, of course, but what's your definition of plant-based? Because, you know, I think plant-based has taken on, it's sort of become equivalent with vegan vegetarian diets, but some people would argue that. So how do you look at it?
Yeah, so what I did in Ketotarian was gave vegan ketogenic options. So there's definitely many dishes, and there's a lot of recipes and pretty pictures and all that stuff that people love, and how to do it practically and, you know, simply. But there's vegan ketogenic, there's vegetarian ketogenic, and then there's pescatarian ketogenic, or wild-caught fish and shellfish, which I call vegetarian, basically plant-based, but with the wild-caught fish. So plant-based, to answer your question, plant-based in my mind involves all of that stuff, even if there is vegetarian options with the eggs and the ghee and that sort of vegetarian ketogenic options, as well as the pescatarian. Because if your plate is primarily still plant-based and you have the fat and protein from the wild-caught fish, that's still plant-based in my mind. But I definitely agree with you in the fact that depending on who you ask, they will, in their mind, they will make that plant-based synonymous with vegan. And by all means it is, but I think that there's room in the plant-based world for vegetarians and pescatarians and even people that eat red meat as well, as long as their plate is primarily plants. I still put that under the umbrella of being plant-based. It's not entirely plant, but depends on the level of what the person wants to do in their life.
The idea is just having a clear picture of kind of what the diet looks like. We use the term plant rich to describe what we usually recommend to our clients because it is very, very heavy in vegetables, especially fibrous vegetables. But we allow some room for some animal products in there as well, as long as they're good quality, which kind of is my next question. I love the pescatarian idea, but of course there's a lot of concerns about fish, about quality of fish, arsenic in fish, mercury, even in wild caught fish sometimes, and seafood. So where do you draw the line? How often do you think is sort of appropriate, for maybe what you would do or you would have your family do, or even your clients, patients, when it comes to consuming fish?
Yeah. So I used a few different sources when I'm writing the book is getting the best information for the person that's reading it as far as the quality of the fish, and being mindful of the state of our oceans and the state of our seas and the seafood that lives inside of it. So I used the Environmental Working Group and a few other sources that are really kind of have exhaustive research and lists as far as what's the cleanest fish to eat. So that's what I used in the book, and was very specific about it, because it's like, as I was studying, you could have like the same type of fish, but depending on where you got it would determine a lot of the level of its health benefits and the problematic aspects of these heavy metal toxicity issues that are found in some fish. So going off of the clean list, I think that the overwhelming benefits of it are like, just, there's so many good benefits off of the, slightly negatives. And honestly, anything in our food supply, there's some literature of saying, well, this could happen or this could happen. I mean, even with the beef, grass-fed beef, they're concerned about heavy metals and the bones of the people having all this bone broth, and then they're concerned about heavy metals there. So I think there's a problem with food supply as a general rule, but do the best you can, and not having people be fearful of it, but do the best you can with the best current data that's out there, and give the rest to God, and not be overly stressed and obsessed about it, because that stress isn't good for our health either.
Yeah, good point. I think we can become too obsessive. And, sometimes I notice people sometimes focus on the minutia, or things that maybe are important, but are a little less important for their current health situation than other things. For example, they may focus on only eating organic produce, but then they're still sneaking off and getting a donut or drinking, orange juice or something like that that's not that great for them. So I think sometimes we have to look at the big picture first and say, okay, let me make sure I'm doing, as much as I can to move these, I call them, the big levers, to move the big levers of health that are going to make the biggest difference. And then obviously organic and grass-fed and pastured and so forth is better. So if you have that choice, of course, make that choice. But sometimes I notice people get too focused on maybe what might be considered more detailed-oriented decisions, and they forget about the big things. Have you noticed that sometimes?
Oh, totally. I think when you're in this world of wellness, or you have a lot of health seekers out there that are listening to this right now, is that it comes with good intentions, but that's the double-edged sword of the power of Dr. Google. That's like the endless vortex of conflicting information. Dr. Google is quite a fickle doctor. So I think that is not good for some personality types. Some people can compartmentalize it and they can handle it and they can make sense of what's right for them. A lot of people can't. And I think that, it's about the bigger picture and doing the best you can, and having some clarity and not letting all that information stress you out.
Yeah, speaking of that, there's a lot of conflicting data in the diabetes community right now, blood sugar community, about what the best diet is, low carb. Of course, there's the standard American approach, and then there's the American Diabetes Association, Heart Association approach, which has been pushed for a long time. And I think most people agree that that's not a good approach, for at least most people in our community do. But then, there's a split, and a lot of people who dismiss that move more towards a plant-based approach. And then others move more towards this keto low carb approach. And, some are high protein, some are high fat. So there's a lot of disagreement there. because of your focus on ketogenic and plant-based, you're sort of in the middle, because the plant-based guys will typically keep the fat really low, sometimes less than 30 grams a day, or certainly less than 10% of the diet coming from fat. And obviously a ketogenic diet is not that. So how do you view fat? And what's your thoughts on sort of these ultra low fat diets?
Yeah. And part of my mission, I almost saw myself as like a missionary for both the plant-based community and the ketogenic community, of how to teach the plant-based vegans and the vegetarians how to do what they're doing healthily. Because some people, based off of personal preference, they just don't really like eating meat, or religious or ethical convictions, or they maybe have some genetic impairments where they don't do well, or they have gut problems and not doing well with certain foods. So how can you do that in a healthy way? And then the ketogenic world, how do you do that in a healthy way? How do you avoid the pitfalls of the ketogenic diet as it's done a lot of times in today's blogosphere? So how do you kind of marry the best of both? Obviously, I don't think that the way that the standard vegan, vegetarian world is talking about is good for a lot of people. I think if you're going through inflammatory problems, or if you're going through gut problems, or autoimmune issues, or diabetes, metabolic syndrome, which is a lot of people, I just mentioned most of the United States right there, that's not going to work for them long term. It's definitely better than the standard American diet, but better doesn't mean optimal. And I think that that's where we get confused here, is that you have two groups of people that are debating about something that are better, but not necessarily the best. And I wanted to sort of get the best of both of those worlds, and then say, okay, look, this is A, what we have in common, and B, this is what you do on a practical level to improve your health. But I am very much aware of, because I see patients all day long, that there is no one size fits all. And it's really hard to encapsulate every nuance of the human biochemistry in a book. But I did the best that I could to really kind of say, okay, here's your starting point. This is how you do a plant-based ketogenic diet, and you can pick your level. You can be completely vegan ketogenic, you can be vegetarian ketogenic, or you could be pescatarian or vegetarian ketogenic. And then from there, to put the time in, and I said 60 days in the book, to kind of shift your body from being a sugar burner to a fat burner, decreasing inflammation levels while still feeding your gut with all those good fibers to help your microbiome. And then from there, find your carb sweet spot. Basically, and I gave them basically tools to increase carbohydrates from real food carbs, and find where you feel the best, and test your blood sugar, test your ketones, test how you feel, and just use real life as a lab. And then obviously you would decrease fat from there. So it may be a moderate fat, moderate protein, lower carb, or even moderate carb for some person, but they still put that 60 days of transitioning the metabolism to being a fat burner. And then from there, they can personalize it. Because I don't necessarily think everybody needs to be in ketosis forever and ever, amen. I think that they can do the time and to kind of get their health rehabbed and shift their body metabolically to a healthier place. And from there, they can personalize it. But some people, because of their health issues, have to be in ketosis or at least lower carb world for long periods of time. And they know when they go out of it, they don't feel as good. Their labs don't look as good. The blood sugar spikes, inflammation spikes. So it's about finding their own personal formula through this system.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I'm excited to read. I like that you have these 3 tracks for different people who want to modify the diet a little bit. And, I think my current thinking is there's a big group of people in the middle that could probably do better than they're currently doing on either of those approaches if it's a whole food, real food diet, and like you said, when you're coming from the standard American diet or even just a high carb, diet that has a lot of processed food, and you're moving towards a more real food, whole food diet that gets rid of the packaged processed foods, I think you're going to do better. And especially when you control some of these other factors. There are people that I've had that don't seem to do well on a ketogenic diet, that the way it's classically thought of, more meats and bacon and butter and so forth. It just seems to drive their lipids out of control. They'll get to a certain point and then they just don't progress, and they can't break through that insulin resistance barrier with that level of animal product or fat in their diet. And they do seem to do better on a lower fat, vegan, high plant approach. But I can also tell you there's a lot of people that have come to me from vegan oriented doctors or programs that did terribly and then decided to come try this the way that I teach it instead. So I do think that there's probably a lot of people in the middle that could do well on either approach, that they just need to eat real food and whole food. And I do believe that cutting carbs is important for most people, but certainly eliminating processed refined sugars and starches and grains, I think is a great starting point. For somebody who wants to try this vegan track, how do they get their protein? Because to me, especially if you have diabetes, and for somebody who has diabetes and blood sugar issues, sometimes people just don't tolerate grains at all. I can't think of the last person that I've taken care of that's been able to eat oatmeal, for example. That's an example I use because it's recommended by a lot of people in the conventional system, but it spikes everybody's blood sugar that I've taken care of, and that's thousands. Beans and legumes, I think, are somewhere in the middle, so I think that can be a protein source. But a lot of people can't tolerate the starch in beans and lentils and legumes, and so I'm just curious, for a vegan, do you think that we don't need that much protein, or how do they get their protein on this type of diet?
Yeah, so it definitely is, in my mind, because I kind of talk about my own journey in Ketotarian and how I was that classic high carb, low fat, just unintentionally, but vegan for a lot of years, and how it messed my health up, and how to do it the right way. I don't think that necessarily someone has to abandon veganism. I think they can be a vegan ketogenic dieter or a vegan low carb dieter and be fine. But I bring the argument up, and I don't maybe use the word argument, I bring the facts up of the bioavailability of a lot of the nutrients that are in plant-based foods and how they're missing out maybe in some of the benefits in the egg yolk or in the ghee or in the fish and in the shellfish. So I definitely want to open the minds of the vegan eater, because some of them, it's not a religious thing, and they're just trying to do the well-intentioned thing. Sometimes it's not even the ethical thing. And we talk about getting good sources of food, ethically farmed things in the book. But let's just say somebody has to be completely vegan, and they're not willing, or they don't want to bring in fish, or they don't want to bring in ghee and other things that wouldn't be vegan. Then what I recommend in the book for them to do the vegan ketogenic diet the healthy way would be fermented soy, so tempeh and natto, which is the source of good fat-soluble vitamin like K2, as well as a good protein source, and nuts and seeds. So those are going to be their primary protein sources. And then obviously from there, the vegetarian and the pescatarian have more options. But it is limited. Let's say the person doesn't love the fermented soy. Let's say they hate it. They're going to have a conversation with themselves and kind of determine, maybe these other tracks are for me. Maybe I'm not doing this sustainably, and kind of showing them the macros, because the math isn't lying. And if they're not hitting their macros in a way that's sustainable for optimal human health, they're going to have to decide what's right for them. They can do it, but they're going to have more limitations. And so it's definitely feasible. And look, I don't know if you know Dr. Diolis, Carrie Diolis. She's a orthopedic surgeon in Ohio. She's doing amazing things. She's type 1 diabetic, and she's completely vegan ketogenic. She's thriving there. And she actually wrote a blurb for the book, and she kind of lives and breathes this too. So I've kind of picked her brain a lot through this whole experience as someone that's doing the vegan ketogenic diet in a very healthy way. Yeah, so it's definitely doable. Lots of people do it. There's a lot of Facebook groups online that are doing it, but they are definitely limited. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If they love what they eat and if they're super healthy, it's not limited to them. That's a relative way of thinking. But somebody that does want more variety in their life, they're going to have to really be mindful of are they willing to get other protein sources.
Man, I'm glad you said that, because that's such an important factor. And I didn't mention that earlier, but that's one thing for new clients. Sometimes I'll just ask if they're really asking about vegan diet, vegetarian diet, and so forth. Some of them, I think, just prefer those types of foods, and others don't, but feel like this sense of pressure to move that way, and they're looking for an out. So, it depends on kind of why they're asking the question. But sometimes I'll just ask, and like you just said, what's your preference? Would you rather eat? Sometimes I'll put it in the reverse. Do you think you'd have a harder time living without things like avocados and olive oil and these yummy high fat foods that fit really well into a keto diet and a low carb diet? But on that, again, I'm talking about that sort of low fat plant based approach that's oftentimes preached for diabetes. Or would you have a harder time giving up fruit, for example, large amounts, copious amounts of fruit, and other, some of these plant-based foods that we would ask you to give up, grains, breads, those types of things. And sometimes, it's their preference. Some people just aren't into those fatty foods, and they'd rather eat lots of vegetables and eat a few more fruits, and they might do better on that approach. What I found, though, is most people seem to do better, and it seems to be more sustainable to follow what you're describing, which is a plant-rich diet with lots of healthy fats and incorporating sort of minimal amounts of animal products.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the middle ground there. And again, it's a lot of it's personal preference and where they feel the best on. So it's also being mindful of your body and not being maybe not going about things and eating because of this idealistic viewpoint, and you're not even checking in with your body. Because sometimes vegans, they will go and they'll say, well, this is the right thing to do, and it's very politically driven, but yet it's at the expense of their own health. And at that point, they're going to have to say, can I do this in a way that's also conducive to my health, or am I willing to bring some other things into my life that I have to question why I'm doing what I'm doing?
Yeah. So do you think certain animal products like red meat, beef, let's say, and chicken or poultry, turkey, do you think these foods are bad for us? Do you think that overconsumption of them is bad for us? Do you think they're inflammatory in some ways? And I'll have a question about butter out there too. Maybe you can address all those.
Yeah. So as a general statement, no, I don't think that they're unhealthy. I think that if you get good sources of meat, grass-fed meat, wild, organic, pasture-raised chicken, all that good stuff, and grass-fed butter, I think that those are all good foods that people can have. I just don't think that for the average person, that should be the center of their food. I don't think that should be the majority of their food. I think that should be the smaller amounts. I think that should be a couple times a week, one time a week. I think that it's a good source, but I think variety is important. And sometimes people that are eating that way, they're eating a lot of it. They're not eating a lot of vegetables, and then that's all they're having. There are definitely some people that do better with less saturated fats. And I think that's to your point of what you talked about previously, is there's different genetic mutations like ApoE4, there's different fatty acid binding protein genetic mutations. These are basically genetic mutations. I know that you know this, but maybe for people that are listening, these single nucleotide polymorphisms that they genetically just don't do well with lots of saturated fats. It's, as you said, it can raise their abnormal, it's going to raise inflammation levels. It's going to cause their lipids to be completely out of balance. And also there's this microbiome component too. So a lot of people that are doing the well-intentioned things, having the ketogenic high fat things, maybe that butter coffee, that have these gut problems, that have intestinal permeability, or leaky gut syndrome. And it's actually raising inflammation through those lipopolysaccharides, as bacterial endotoxins and endotoxemia. Basically, it's raising inflammation throughout the body. But they're eating ketogenic diet and having more of these saturated fats, namely grass-fed beef, pork, and butter. And I think that those people, whether it's the gut problem or genetic issue or personal preference, then they're going to have to come up with other options of how to do the ketogenic or the low carb diet in a way that's sustainable for their health. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. I don't think, and I actually talk about that in the book. You can bring red meat, do the 60 days, bring red meat in later on if you want to, and find your own personal formula.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you mentioned the gut and the microbiome. There's some studies on enterotype, which basically describe the microbiome of people who tend to be metabolically healthier versus the people who tend to be metabolically challenged. And it seems to be, again, that more plant foods tend to lead to a leaner, more metabolically healthy enterotype. Have you looked at that research?
I have. Yeah. And we know our gut, our microbiome, our bacteria in our gut are what we eat, so we have to feed it foods, and the foods that it really loves to eat predominantly is plant foods. So all the good fiber that then the bacteria ferments and they make short chain fatty acids. One of that short chain fatty acid is butyrate, which is the cousin, metabolically speaking, to beta hydroxybutyrate, the main ketone. And it has butyrate, which is this product of bacterial fermentation in the gut from plant foods, has the same benefits, similar benefits as beta hydroxybutyrate. So it helps with mitochondrial function and energy and immune function and driving inflammation levels down, all those good things that ketones do. And I think this goes back to maybe the standard ketogenic dieter is becoming fearful of plant foods because they're looking at the carb content and they're thinking, oh, this isn't good for me. And they become fearful of plants, which is what I need to kind of get across in Ketotarian to the ketogenic dieter, to not abhor plant foods because of their carb content. And we talk about net carbs and fiber and all that other stuff and the benefits that it has for the microbiome.
Man, we can get so in the weeds with diet that we lose sight of some simple, seemingly obvious things, like eat natural, foods and plants. When have plants, especially fibrous vegetables, ever been unhealthy? I mean, there's maybe a few things that people watch out for with, goitrogenic foods and so forth. But, to me, these are just obvious truths that, well, I guess there are no obvious truths in nutrition anymore. It's just, it all really depends on your perspective. But it's amazing how deep we can get in the weeds on some of these things, and we just lose sight of the big picture sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. So hopefully, and that's what, just seeing the mental, emotional, and psychological component to patients' lives and being with patients every day, that's an important part of what I wanted to convey in Ketotarian, is that this is not meant to fear food. This is not meant to punish your body with dieting. This isn't meant to become obsessive with counting macros. This is about finding out what makes your body feel great. And that's freedom, really. And knowing how you thrive and how you improve your health and improve your labs, that's a good thing. And then the rest of it needs to be dropped by the wayside. And we can't be stressed and obsessed about food. It's just not a healthy place to be at. And I think that, becoming orthorexic in our world and seeing the patients out there and seeing the healthcare providers out there become overly obsessive about food. It's that fine balance of information that works for you and then dropping the rest. So I make that a big point, because in the book I talk about you can get your macros perfect. You could eat the best quality foods under the sun. But if you are really hating the foods that you eat, and if you have a bad relationship with food, you're not making foods your friend, and you're still in this dieting consciousness, maybe left over from the past, it is an uphill battle, and you're self-sabotaging. You have to get that part right too. And then out of realizing your intrinsic worth, will flow healthy actions. And that has to be the ethos, the origin of why somebody is going towards these healthy foods that we're talking about. It's really loving your body enough to nourish it with good food medicine, not punishing it or hating it. You can't heal a body you hate. And it's really, this has to be the cornerstone of all the food choices that I think we make.
Oh man, that is such a beautiful message, and I'll just echo that because it's so true. I've noticed even with myself personally, like if I'm craving foods that I don't normally eat, or just feeling like I'm overeating, like I'm eating when I don't really need to be eating. I just had a meal, 2 hours ago, and I'm reaching for some sort of, an RX bar or something like that. I just sometimes I'll get into this pattern. And sometimes I just have to stop and say, where is this coming from? And it's usually coming from a place of like, I've lost something. I've lost a little bit of self-love, or I've become overstressed or focused on the wrong thing. And sometimes you just have to center yourself. And you're right. When you're in that place of grounded energy, self-love, positiveness, you're just emanating that, you just naturally make better health decisions. You eat better, you take better care of yourself, you sleep better, and you move your body and exercise. And I think that's where health really starts. And that's not being talked about enough.
Yeah, it is. It's not talked about in the health world enough. And I think because we know all the cool benefits that these foods have, and it's coming from a well-intentioned place, but sometimes it can become a monster and actually create more problems unintentionally. It's like, the analogy is like, if you realize you're a Tesla and not an old junker, how are you going to treat yourself? And that's where you need to go from. Where are you going to park yourself? What are you going to fuel yourself with? How are you going to take care of it and be a good steward to the gift that you've been given, the health that you've been given, or the health that you're building? I think that has to be the genesis of all food choices and wellness choices and physical movement and mind-body component. And it never ends.
Beautiful, man. I love that. Well, I could talk to you all day, but we're kind of running out of time. So there's a few questions that I love to ask each of my guests, and I'd love to finish with these for you. And the first one is, at this point in your work, and I know you're still young and you've got a lot ahead of you and still a lot of great things left to do, but at this point, what statement, quote, or point do you think would best summarize your work to date, your professional work?
I would say at this moment, health is a sacred journey. And that's just me as being a functional medicine practitioner, of just being a part of someone's journey. It's humbling. It's super rewarding to be a part of someone regaining their health. Beautiful.
I love that. Health is a sacred journey, and it is for sure. If you had a good friend or family member who was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, you didn't really know what was going on with them, they came and told you that they just got this diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, and they came to you for some advice, as a confidant. You had 2-3 minutes to give them your best advice. What would you tell them to do?
Food-wise?
Whatever.
Yeah. Well, I would go back to that. You cannot heal a body you hate first. And it's kind of starting that as being their origin of why they're going to make changes. And then I would say, cut processed foods out, decrease your carbohydrates, and increase your healthy fats. If I had 2 to 3 minutes, that's probably what I would say.
And just give them some details on that, yeah. Right? And hand them your book, probably.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, my friend, last question here for you today is, if you found yourself in a room around a table with 20 global leaders, presidents, prime ministers of various countries, and they brought you in as an expert to try to help them solve the diabetes epidemic globally, what advice would you give them?
I would say they have to abandon the current advice that they're giving people. And I think they have to be okay with saying that we kind of got it wrong. And it's hard when you're that level of government, influence, I think, to have recommendations for everybody because we're all different. But I think that they're going to have to really start educating people on that level to not fear healthy fats. And I think that that is a big shift in the advice that our government would have. I would educate them on the benefits of healthy fats first. And this idea, like you're saying, telling everybody to have oatmeal and these carbohydrates as long as they're whole grain. I think that we're going to have to really educate people on the damage that's doing for a lot of people's health.
Well, we have a lot of work to do, but you're doing some great work, and I'm excited to read your book. Excited for the world to read your book and to get this information out there. I love the concept, and I think sometimes we need to lay down our swords and try to come together to really bring health to the world, because we are right now going down a pretty bad path, and diabetes is becoming a major issue. So I appreciate everything you're doing. I just want to honor you for the great work that you're doing in functional medicine, and encourage everybody to go grab, when it comes out in late August, go grab Ketotarian by Dr. Will Cole. So thank you, my friend, and I appreciate you being part of the Mastering Blood Sugar podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Thanks for being here as well. And I'll be back next week with another expert interview.